Every economics textbook tells you the same story. Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, gave us the invisible hand. Markets regulate themselves. Government interference distorts natural efficiency. Leave buyers and sellers alone, and prices find their perfect level. Supply meets demand. Greed becomes good. The invisible hand guides it all. You learned this in school. You hear it from politicians. Economists invoke Smith's name like scripture. Here's the truth they never mention. Adam Smith used the phrase invisible hand exactly 3 times in his entire written work. 3 times. Across thousands of pages, decades of writing, and 2 major books, he never defined it. He never built a theory around it. He mentioned it in passing, almost as an aside. The economic doctrine you were taught as Adam Smith's central insight, he never wrote it. This stands as one of intellectual history's largest acts of selective quotation. A casual metaphor became the foundation of global economic policy. A man who supported banking regulations, usury laws, public education, and progressive taxation became the patron saint of deregulation. The invisible hand did not make free market ideology inevitable. 20th-century economists engineered it into existence. They extracted 3 words from context. They built a structural framework around a passing phrase. They created intellectual infrastructure to serve specific policy goals. They made their ideology appear ancient, inevitable, scientific. The machinery of this transformation operated through universities, think tanks, and government advisory boards. Chicago school economists served as gatekeepers of Smith's legacy. They controlled the bottlenecks of economic education. They applied leverage at pressure points throughout academic publishing and policy debate. The concentration of interpretive authority in a single school of thought allowed the extraction of meaning from fragments while the full text gathered dust. This is Noob Historian. History has owners. We name them. The policies affecting your life right now rest on this misquotation. The 2008 financial crisis, the ongoing debates about cryptocurrency, tech monopolies, gig worker protections, climate policy, healthcare costs. Every time someone argues markets will sort themselves out, they invoke Adam Smith's authority. They cite a man who warned against trusting merchants and manufacturers. They quote an economist who supported extensive government intervention. They build policy on a misreading, your retirement account, your job security, your healthcare options. Your government's ability to regulate the banks holding your money. All of it connects to the common understanding of Adam Smith's words. Understanding his actual writing changes the arguments remaining valid in policy debate. It exposes which ideas possess historical authority and which ideas borrowed authority through distortion. The invisible hand did not shape the modern economy. The myth of the invisible hand did. And myths have authors. Let us examine the actual text. Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776. This 900-page work became the founding document of economics as a discipline. Generations of economists claimed it as their intellectual foundation. The phrase invisible hand appears in this book exactly once. Find it in Book 4, Chapter 2. Smith discusses why merchants prefer domestic trade over foreign trade. His argument centers on risk and security. A merchant keeps capital close to home because foreign investment feels dangerous. Distance creates uncertainty. The merchant wants to watch over his money. Here is the passage in full context. Smith writes about the merchant. He intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Read the next sentence, Smith immediately adds, nor is it always the worse for the society. Notice the word always. Smith acknowledges exceptions. He does not claim markets produce optimal outcomes as a rule. He says private interest does not always harm society. This is a far weaker claim. It admits failure cases. It recognizes limits. The passage concerns domestic versus foreign investment preferences. Nothing more. Smith does not describe a general mechanism by which all markets achieve efficiency. He does not argue against regulation. He does not claim government intervention distorts natural market outcomes. He explains why merchants keep money at home. Full stop. Now consider Smith's second use of the phrase. 17 years earlier, in 1759, Smith published The Theory of Moral Sentiments. This philosophical work preceded his economic writing. Here, he uses invisible hand in a passage about wealth distribution. Smith describes wealthy landowners. He calls them selfish. He notes their natural selfishness and rapacity. These rich men want to consume everything their lands produce. They want to hoard. They fail in this desire. They need workers to farm their estates. They need servants to maintain their households. They need an entire support structure. Their greed forces them to share wealth they would prefer to keep. Smith writes these selfish landowners are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants. This passage argues for income distribution. It claims the wealthy share more than they intend. It does not praise market efficiency. It does not argue against government redistribution. The passage suggests nature forces a redistribution the wealthy oppose. Chicago school economists did not quote this passage. It undermines their project. The third appearance comes in Smith's History of Astronomy, an early unpublished work. Here Smith discusses Jupiter, the Roman god. Ancient peoples attributed events they did not understand to divine intervention. Jupiter's invisible hand guided thunderbolts. This use is theological and anthropological. It has nothing to do with economics. 3 uses across a lifetime of writing. One about domestic investment preferences, one about wealth redistribution forced on selfish landlords, one about Roman mythology and primitive theology. From these 3 passing references, 20th-century economists constructed an entire doctrine. They built global policy on a phrase Smith never defined, never emphasized, and never developed into theory. The concentration of intellectual authority in so few words reveals how ideological leverage operates. You do not need to control all the texts. You control the quotations people remember. You control the summaries. You control the textbook versions. You extract the useful fragments and let the rest fade from memory. Smith wrote thousands of pages about economics, morality, jurisprudence, and philosophy. The invisible hand occupies perhaps 200 words in total. The ratio of ink spilled about this phrase to ink Smith himself used approaches absurdity. Emma Rothschild, the Harvard economic historian, calculated the disproportion in her book Economic Sentiments. She found the phrase received virtually no attention for 150 years following Smith's death. Then it became everything. The sudden elevation tells you the change originated not in Smith, but in those who needed him to mean something new. The original passages remain available to anyone willing to read them. Few people do. The summaries suffice. The textbook versions spread. The myth replaces the text. Adam Smith supported government intervention in the economy. He wrote it plainly. He argued for it extensively. His students recorded him advocating regulation in his Glasgow University lectures. This information is available to anyone who reads his work. It remains absent from popular understanding because it contradicts the useful myth. Begin with banking. Smith advocated legal limits on interest rates, usury laws. He wanted government to cap how much lenders charged borrowers. In Book 2, Chapter 4 of The Wealth of Nations, Smith argues interest rates should sit slightly above market rates to prevent money from flowing to prodigals and projectors who waste capital on speculation. Modern free market ideology treats interest rate caps as distortions. Smith treated them as necessary protection. Smith went further on banking regulation. He argued government should require minimum bank reserves. He compared loose banking practices to fire hazards in dense cities. The government regulates building construction to prevent fire spread. It should regulate banking to prevent financial contagion. His exact words: such regulations may, no doubt, be considered as, in some respect, a violation of natural liberty, but those exertions of the natural liberty of a few individuals, which might endanger the security of the whole society, are and ought to be restrained by the laws of all governments. Adam Smith wrote those sentences. The father of free market economics argued government should restrain liberty when it endangers society. He supported bank regulation by name, moved to infrastructure. Smith argued government must provide roads, bridges, canals, and harbors. Private enterprise will not build sufficient infrastructure because the benefits spread too widely. Individual investors lack incentive when returns diffuse across society. Government fills this gap. Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations details essential government functions. Smith lists 3 duties of the sovereign. First, national defense. Second, administration of justice. Third, erecting and maintaining certain public works and certain public institutions, which it can never be for the interest of any individual or small number of individuals to erect and maintain. Infrastructure spending, written into Smith's core framework of government responsibility. Education follows. Smith advocated mandatory public schooling. Book Fee argues the division of labor makes workers ignorant by trapping them in repetitive tasks. Their mental faculties deteriorate. A man who spends his life performing one simple operation has no occasion to exert his understanding, and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. Government must provide education to counteract this degradation. Smith wanted workers to read, write, and do arithmetic at public expense. He proposed state-funded schools in every district. He wrote, "For a very small expense, the public can facilitate, can encourage, and can even impose upon almost the whole body of the people the necessity of acquiring those most essential parts of education." The invisible hand doctrine opposes government provision of services. Adam Smith supported government schools. Taxation reveals the same pattern. Book 5, Chapter 2, contains Smith's 4 maxims of taxation. The first maxim states subjects should contribute to government in proportion to their respective abilities. Smith writes, "The wealthy should pay something more than in proportion to their income. This is progressive taxation. Higher rates for higher incomes. The father of free market economics argued the rich should pay more. Jacob Viner, one of the 20th century's most respected economists, cataloged Smith's positions in a 1927 essay titled Adam Smith and Laissez-faire. Viner documented at least 14 categories where Smith endorsed government intervention. The list includes regulation of banking and finance, usury laws, infrastructure construction, public education, postal services, progressive taxation, patents and copyrights, enforcement of contracts, quality standards for goods, standardization of weights and measures, protection of workers from dangerous conditions, regulation of monopolies, and restraints on market concentration. 14 categories of legitimate government action. From the man free market ideologues claim as their founder. Viner's essay appeared in 1927. Economists have known about Smith's regulatory positions for nearly a century. This information did not reach public understanding. It did not shape textbook presentations. It did not affect political rhetoric. The gatekeepers of economic education controlled which Adam Smith remained visible. They chose the invisible hand. They buried the regulations. The transformation of Adam Smith's legacy did not happen by accident. It required institutional machinery, sustained effort, and strategic selection of texts. Emma Rothschild traced this evolution through archival research, documented in her 2001 book, Economic Sentiments. Her findings carry the weight of primary source analysis. Rothschild examined how 19th century economists read Smith. She searched for references to the invisible hand in their work. She found virtually nothing. The great economists who followed Smith did not treat the invisible hand as significant. David Ricardo did not emphasize it. John Stuart Mill did not build on it. Alfred Marshall did not cite it as Smith's central contribution. For 150 years following The Wealth of Nations, economists read Smith without elevating 3 words above the thousands of pages surrounding them. The phrase remained obscure. The elevation came later. The change began in the early 20th century. It accelerated after World War II. The Cold War created demand for an intellectual alternative to Marxism. Capitalism needed its own founding prophet. Adam Smith filled the role. But the Adam Smith of the actual texts posed problems. He supported regulation. He distrusted merchants. He advocated progressive taxation. He wanted government to educate workers and build infrastructure. This Smith served poorly as a weapon against socialist planning. The useful Smith needed to oppose government intervention root and branch. The Chicago School of Economics provided the solution. Milton Friedman, George Stigler, Friedrich Hayek, and their colleagues built an intellectual infrastructure around free market principles. They needed historical authority. They needed a founding figure whose name carried weight independent of contemporary debates. They found Adam Smith. Or rather, they created the Adam Smith they needed. The process operated through selective emphasis. Quote the invisible hand. Ignore the banking regulations. Cite the passage about self-interest promoting public welfare. Skip the warnings against trusting businessmen. Control the textbooks. Graduate students learn from textbooks. They become professors. They write the next generation of textbooks. Each iteration reinforces the selection. The passages receiving emphasis become the entirety of Smith's thought and popular understanding. Control the journals. Academic careers depend on publication. Journals have gatekeepers. Editorial boards select which papers appear. Papers challenging the dominant interpretation face higher barriers. Scholars learn which arguments advance careers and which arguments create obstacles. Control the policy apparatus. Think tanks translate academic ideas into policy proposals. Government advisory positions put economists in rooms where decisions happen. The economists who reach these positions share interpretive frameworks shaped by the same textbooks and journals. The machinery reinforced itself. The concentration of authority in specific institutions allowed leverage at every pressure point in the flow from academic production to public understanding. By the 1980s, this engineered interpretation dominated economic education worldwide. Students learned Adam Smith proved markets worked best without government interference. They learned the invisible hand guided resources to their most efficient uses. They learned regulation distorted natural market outcomes. They did not learn what Smith wrote about usury laws. They did not learn his support for banking regulation. They did not learn his advocacy for public education, progressive taxation, and infrastructure spending. They did not learn his warnings about merchants and manufacturers who have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public. The extraction succeeded. The useful fragments replaced the full text. The myth became the man. Ronald Reagan quoted Adam Smith. Margaret Thatcher invoked him. Policy documents cited him. Deregulation proceeded under his authority. The invisible hand doctrine guided the removal of financial regulations, the privatization of public services, and the reduction of progressive taxation. The man who supported all these interventions became the justification for eliminating them. October 23, 2008. Alan Greenspan sits before the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. The former Federal Reserve Chairman testifies about the financial crisis engulfing the global economy. Greenspan dominated American monetary policy for 18 years. He served under 4 presidents. Markets moved on his words. His belief in deregulation shaped financial policy for 2 decades. He opposed regulation of derivatives. He resisted oversight of subprime lending. He trusted the invisible hand. Now the system has collapsed. Lehman Brothers is gone. AIG required government rescue. Banks hold toxic assets nobody can value. Credit markets have frozen. The entire financial infrastructure teeters on the edge of total failure. Representative Henry Waxman presses Greenspan on his ideology. Waxman asks whether Greenspan placed excessive faith in the ability of markets to self-correct. Greenspan admits error. He tells Congress, "I made a mistake in presuming the self-interests of organizations, specifically banks and others, were such as to ensure they protected their own shareholders and their equity in the firms." He continues, "I have found a flaw. I don't know how significant or permanent it is, but I have been distressed by this fact." The flaw Greenspan identified was the invisible hand itself, or rather, the 20th century version of it. The belief stating banks pursuing profit would naturally avoid catastrophic risk. The assumption stating self-interest would prevent self-destruction. Here is the irony cutting through 2 centuries of intellectual history. Adam Smith warned against exactly this assumption. Book 1, Chapter 11 of The Wealth of Nations, contains Smith's assessment of merchants and manufacturers. He writes clearly, businessmen have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public. He warns proposals from business interests ought always to be listened to with great precaution. Smith continues with unmistakable directness. Such proposals come from an order of men whose interest is never exactly the same with the public, who have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, and who accordingly have, upon many occasions, both deceived and oppressed it. The father of economics warned not to trust businessmen. He said their interests diverge from public welfare. He advised governments to treat their policy proposals with suspicion. The economists who claimed Smith's authority inverted his actual position. They used his name to argue government should trust markets. They cited him to remove the regulations he supported. They built policy on a misreading. The 2008 crisis exposed the consequences. Banks took risks they did not understand. Credit agencies rated toxic debt as safe investment. Traders bet against products they sold to clients. The invisible hand did not guide these actors toward social benefit. It guided them toward catastrophe. Taxpayers funded the rescue. The Federal Reserve injected trillions into the financial system. Governments around the world coordinated emergency measures. The cleanup required exactly the government intervention the invisible hand doctrine opposed. The crisis should have ended the misreading. It did not. Within 2 years, the same arguments returned. Regulation would distort markets. Government interference would create inefficiency. The invisible hand would sort things out if politicians stopped meddling. Financial interests funded think tanks restating the old positions. Policy debates resumed their pre-crisis patterns. The academic infrastructure remained intact. The textbooks did not change. The interpretation survived the collapse it produced. This persistence reveals something about how intellectual machinery operates. A single failure, even a catastrophic one, does not dismantle institutional frameworks. The people who built careers on certain interpretations do not abandon them when evidence contradicts them. The organizations funded to promote certain policies do not close when those policies fail. The invisible hand doctrine has never been about Adam Smith. It has been about contemporary interests dressed in historical clothing. The clothing survived 2008 because the interests survived. You live inside debates shaped by Adam Smith's misquotation. Every day, policies affecting your life invoke an argument the man never made. Consider cryptocurrency regulation. Advocates argue blockchain technology creates trustless systems requiring no government oversight. The invisible hand will guide digital markets. Buyers and sellers will negotiate efficient outcomes. Fraud will fail because information flows freely and reputations matter. Adam Smith argued for government regulation of banking and currency. He wanted state oversight of monetary systems. He supported intervention preventing speculation and fraud. His position on crypto would not be ambiguous. Consider technology monopolies. For years, policy assumed markets would self-correct concentrations of control. Competition would emerge. Startups would challenge incumbents. The invisible hand would prevent any single company from dominating information flow. Amazon, Google, Apple, Meta, and Microsoft now control infrastructure underlying most digital commerce and communication. The predicted competition did not arrive. The invisible hand did not disperse their structural advantages. Bottleneck control persisted and expanded. Adam Smith warned against market concentration. He criticized monopolies extensively. He wanted government to prevent the accumulation of gatekeeping positions. Current antitrust debates about tech companies invoke invisible hand assumptions against interventions Smith would have supported. Consider gig economy labor. Companies classify workers as independent contractors. They argue market forces will produce fair compensation. Workers will negotiate rates reflecting their value. The invisible hand will balance labor supply and demand without minimum wage laws or benefits requirements. Adam Smith wrote about the imbalance between employers and workers. He noted masters faced no legal barriers to combining, while laws prohibited worker combinations. He recognized structural inequality in bargaining leverage. He did not assume market forces would overcome the advantages of concentrated capital against dispersed labor. Consider climate policy. For decades, economists argued markets would price environmental externalities. Companies would internalize pollution costs to attract environmentally conscious consumers. The invisible hand would guide production toward sustainability as information spread and preferences shifted. Carbon emissions continued rising. Markets did not price the externality. Companies did not internalize the costs they imposed on others. The invisible hand did not account for damage inflicted on future generations or distant populations outside the transaction. The 2022 CHIPS Act and Inflation Reduction Act represent a policy shift toward industrial planning. Government now directs investment towards semiconductor manufacturing and clean energy production. This represents explicit rejection of invisible hand assumptions about market allocation. China's state-directed capitalism poses the same challenge. Chinese economic growth occurred through extensive government planning, directed credit, and strategic industrial policy. The model contradicts predictions, stating markets without government direction produce superior outcomes. ESG investing debates center on whether markets naturally price social and environmental factors into asset values. Opponents argue investors pursuing returns will select for sustainability without regulatory mandates. Proponents argue market failures and pricing externalities require intervention. Healthcare costs in the United States exceed those of any other developed nation, while outcomes lag behind countries with more government intervention. The market has not produced the efficiency the invisible hand predicts. Consumers lack the information and bargaining leverage to negotiate prices. Emergency care eliminates choice entirely. In each of these policy arenas, participants invoke Adam Smith's authority. They cite the invisible hand as settled economic principle. They treat government intervention as deviation from natural market order. They cite a man who would have argued the opposite position. They quote an economist who supported extensive government action. They build contemporary policy on an 18th century text they have not read. The misreading persists because it serves interests. Deregulation benefits specific economic actors. Tax cuts for the wealthy need intellectual justification. Opposition to worker protections requires historical authority. Resistance to climate policy needs an economic framework treating market outcomes as natural and government intervention as distortion. The invisible hand provides this authority. It makes policy preferences appear as natural law. It transforms ideology into science. It gives a Scottish moral philosopher's passing metaphor the force of physical principle. Understanding the misquotation does not resolve policy debates. Reasonable people disagree about the proper scope of government action. Markets do produce beneficial outcomes in many contexts. Regulation does create costs alongside benefits. These are legitimate disagreements. But honest debate requires accurate citation. Arguments drawing authority from Adam Smith should reflect his actual positions. Policies claiming historical precedent should survive examination of historical sources. The invisible hand, as commonly invoked, has no historical precedent in Smith's work. It is a 20th century construction dressed in 18th century clothing. It borrows authority it did not earn. It claims lineage from a thinker who would have rejected its conclusions. You now know what Adam Smith wrote. You know how many times he used the phrase. You know what context surrounded each appearance. You know what he argued about banking, taxation, education, and regulation. You know how 20th century economists transformed his legacy through selective emphasis and institutional leverage. The next time someone invokes the invisible hand to argue against government action, ask a simple question. In which passage does Smith develop this theory? The answer will tell you whether they engage with Adam Smith or with a myth constructed in his name. The invisible hand was never the foundation of market economics. It was a metaphor, used in passing, about domestic investment preferences and the redistribution of wealth from selfish landlords to their workers. Everything else was added later by people who needed an intellectual authority they could shape to their purposes. The man they cite would have disagreed with them. The text they reference does not support them. The doctrine they built rests on selective quotation and institutional control over interpretation. Now you know the origin of the myth, the interests it serves, and the text it claims to represent. The three-word phrase, shaping global economic policy, appears 3 times in thousands of pages. The Economist invoked against regulation supported regulation extensively. The authority cited for free markets warned against trusting the businessmen who promote them. This is the history they never taught you. The official version serves interests. The actual text serves understanding. You hold both versions now. Choose which one guides your thinking about the debates shaping your world.